The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very dangerous time in history. It happened in October 1962, and honestly, the world stood on the very edge of a nuclear war. The two most powerful countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, were in a tense standoff. This was all part of a larger conflict called the Cold War. It wasn't a war with direct fighting between these two superpowers. Instead, it was a long period of political tension and military rivalry. Both sides competed for influence around the globe. And both had built thousands of nuclear weapons. These weapons were so powerful they could destroy entire cities in a flash. Everyone understood that a war with these bombs would be a catastrophe for all of humanity. The trouble started close to America's shores. The United States had placed its own nuclear missiles in countries like Turkey and Italy. These missiles were very close to the Soviet Union, and they could reach major Soviet cities in a matter of minutes. This made the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, feel very threatened and insecure. He believed that the United States had an unfair advantage, and he wanted to find a way to balance the power. He needed to place his own missiles just as close to the United States. This would create a similar threat and make the Americans feel the same pressure that he felt every single day. The perfect place for these Soviet missiles was a small island nation in the Caribbean Sea, Cuba. Cuba had recently had a revolution led by Fidel Castro. Castro had established a communist government, which made him a close ally of the Soviet Union. He was also a strong enemy of the United States. The American government had tried to overthrow Castro before, in an event called the Bay of Pigs invasion. This failed attempt made Castro very worried. He feared that the United States would try to invade his country again. He wanted protection, and the Soviet Union was willing to provide it in a very big way. So, a secret plan was made between the Soviet Union and Cuba. The Soviets began to ship medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles to Cuba. They also sent soldiers and equipment to build launch sites for these weapons. They did all of this in complete secrecy, hoping the United States would not find out until it was too late. The plan was simple, but incredibly risky. Once the missile sites were operational, the Soviet Union would be able to launch a nuclear attack on major American cities, including Washington, D.C., with very little warning. This secret deployment of weapons of mass destruction was the spark that ignited the 13 most dangerous days in modern history. Three countries were at the center of this terrifying drama. The first was the United States, led by President John F. Kennedy. He was a young and relatively new president. He had to show strength and resolve to the American people and the world. When he learned about the Soviet missiles in Cuba, he faced an impossible choice. If he did nothing, he would look weak, and the Soviet Union would have a major strategic advantage. But if he attacked Cuba to destroy the missiles, it would almost certainly start a war with the Soviet Union, a war that would quickly become nuclear. Kennedy and his team of advisors had to find a third way, a path between surrender and Armageddon. The second major player was the Soviet Union, led by Premier Nikita Khrushchev. He was an older, more experienced leader, and he was known for his bold and sometimes unpredictable actions. He saw placing missiles in Cuba as a clever move. It would protect his Cuban ally, Fidel Castro, from an American invasion. It would also level the playing field in the Cold War. He believed President Kennedy was young and might back down under pressure. Khrushchev miscalculated how the United States would react. He thought he could install the missiles secretly and then announce their presence to the world, forcing America to accept the new reality. He did not expect such a strong and determined response. The third country involved was Cuba, led by Fidel Castro. Castro was a revolutionary leader. He was very proud and determined to protect his country's independence. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, he was convinced the United States would stop at nothing to remove him from power. For him, allowing Soviet missiles on Cuban soil was a matter of survival. He welcomed the weapons as a deterrent, a way to tell the United States to stay away. Castro was fully prepared to face an American attack. He was less concerned about the global consequences and more focused on the immediate threat to his nation and his government. His readiness for conflict added another layer of danger to the crisis. These three leaders, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro, held the fate of the world in their hands. Each one was under immense pressure from their own government and military. Each one saw the situation from a different point of view. For Kennedy, it was an unacceptable threat right on his doorstep. For Khrushchev, it was a strategic move to correct a power imbalance. For Castro, it was a desperate measure for self-preservation. The combination of these different goals and fears created a situation so tense and volatile that a single mistake, a single miscalculation, could have led to a global nuclear holocaust that would have destroyed civilization as we know it. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew high over Cuba. It took photographs that provided undeniable proof. The pictures clearly showed the construction of Soviet nuclear missile launch sites. When President Kennedy saw these photos, the secret was out. The worst fears of his administration were confirmed. He immediately assembled a group of his most trusted advisors, known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. This group met in secret for several days. They debated what to do. Some military leaders argued for an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. President Kennedy worried that a direct military attack would be an act of war. It would force the Soviet Union to retaliate, perhaps by attacking a US ally like West Berlin. This could quickly spiral out of control into a full-blown nuclear exchange. Kennedy wanted a stronger response than just diplomacy, but a less aggressive one than an invasion. He and his advisors eventually decided on a middle course. They would implement a naval quarantine around Cuba. A quarantine is a type of blockade. It meant that the US Navy would stop and inspect any ships heading to Cuba to prevent more military supplies, especially missiles, from reaching the island. On the evening of October 22, 1962, President Kennedy went on television. He spoke directly to the American people and the world. In a calm but firm voice, he revealed the existence of the Soviet missiles in Cuba. He announced the naval quarantine and made it clear that the United States would not tolerate these offensive weapons so close to its shores. He demanded that the Soviet Union dismantle the missile sites and remove all the weapons from Cuba. The world listened in shock and fear. The two superpowers were now in a direct confrontation. A line had been drawn in the water, and everyone waited to see if the Soviet ships would dare to cross it. The days that followed were filled with incredible tension. American naval ships formed a ring around Cuba. Soviet cargo ships, some likely carrying more missile parts, steamed toward the quarantine line. In the Atlantic Ocean, Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes were also on patrol, shadowing the American fleet. The entire world watched and waited. People stocked up on food and built fallout shelters in their backyards. School children practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks. It felt as if the clock was ticking down to midnight. The question on everyone's mind was the same. What would happen when the Soviet ships reached the American warships? Would they stop, or would the first shots of World War III be fired? As the naval quarantine took effect, the danger level rose higher than ever before. The United States military was placed on high alert at DEFCON 2. This is the highest level of readiness before actual war. For the first and only time in US history, B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons were in the air 24 hours a day, ready to fly toward their targets in the Soviet Union on a moment's notice. The entire planet seemed to hold its breath. In cities from London to Tokyo, people gathered around their radios and televisions, desperate for any news. The fate of civilization rested on the decisions being made in Washington and Moscow. The tension was not just on the sea. On October 27th, a day that would later be called Black Saturday, the crisis nearly boiled over. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet-made surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. This was a major escalation. Many of President Kennedy's military advisors demanded immediate retaliation. They urged him to order airstrikes against the Cuban air defense sites. Kennedy resisted this pressure. He believed that an attack would unleash a chain of events that no one could control. He chose to wait, hoping that a diplomatic solution was still possible. On that same day, another U-2 spy plane on a routine air sampling mission near Alaska accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. The Soviet Union scrambled fighter jets to intercept it. The United States, in turn, scrambled its own nuclear-armed fighters to protect the lost U-2. For a terrifying few minutes, American and Soviet jets were in the air, heading toward each other over the Arctic. A simple navigational error had brought the two superpowers dangerously close to an armed conflict. It was another stark reminder of how easily a global catastrophe could be triggered by accident or miscalculation in such a high-stakes environment. Meanwhile, secret back-channel negotiations were happening between the Kennedy and Khrushchev governments. Messages were exchanged, trying to find a peaceful way out of the crisis. Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles from Cuba if Kennedy promised not to invade the island. Later, he added a new demand. The United States must also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The situation was incredibly complex and fast-moving. With events like the U-2 shootdown and the stray plane over the Arctic, time was running out. Both leaders knew they were losing control of the situation. The world was sliding toward a war that neither of them truly wanted. While the world's attention was focused on the leaders in Washington and Moscow, another critical drama was unfolding deep beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. A group of 4 Soviet submarines had been sent to the Caribbean to protect the missile shipments. These were Foxtrot-class submarines, and they were part of Project Anadir, the code name for the secret Cuban operation. Each of these submarines was armed with 22 standard torpedoes. Crucially, each one also carried a single, very special torpedo. This torpedo had a nuclear warhead with a destructive power similar to the bomb that had been dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. One of these submarines was designated B-59. On board, life was extremely difficult. The submarines were designed for the cold waters of the Arctic, not the warm Caribbean. The air conditioning systems failed, and temperatures inside the submarine soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. The crew was exhausted, suffering from heat and a lack of fresh water. To make matters worse, they had been out of contact with Moscow for days. The submarine had to stay submerged to avoid being detected by the American Navy, which meant they could not raise an antenna to receive radio signals. They were completely cut off, sailing blind in a sea of enemies. The men on B-59 did not know what was happening in the world above. They had no idea if war had already started between the United States and the Soviet Union. Their last orders from Moscow were to defend themselves and the Soviet ships. The American Navy, for its part, was actively hunting for these submarines. Using destroyers and anti-submarine aircraft, the US forces were dropping small, non-lethal depth charges into the ocean. These were meant to be signals, a way of telling the submarines to surface and identify themselves. The Americans thought of them as a form of communication. But for the exhausted and isolated crew of B-59, these explosions felt like an attack. The concussions rattled the submarine's hull, knocking out lights and sending the men stumbling in the dark. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced that they were under attack and that war had already broken out. He believed his submarine was damaged and that he had no choice but to fight back. In this moment of fear and confusion, deep beneath the ocean surface, Captain Savitsky made a terrifying decision. He decided to arm the submarine's nuclear torpedo and prepare to fire it at the American fleet. The command structure on the Soviet submarines during this mission was unique and, as it turned out, critically important. Normally, the captain of a submarine would only need the agreement of his political officer to launch a nuclear weapon. However, because this mission was so important and really so sensitive, a third person had been placed in the chain of command. This man was Vasili Arkhipov. He was the flotilla commander, meaning he was the chief of staff for the entire submarine brigade in the Caribbean. By chance, he was aboard B-59 for this patrol. His presence meant that for the nuclear torpedo to be fired, 3 men had to agree: the captain, the political officer, and Arkhipov himself. Inside the sweltering control room of B-59, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Captain Valentin Savitsky was angry and exhausted. The explosions from the American depth charges were getting closer and more frequent. He shouted, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace the honor of the Navy." He was ready to unleash nuclear devastation. The submarine's political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, reportedly agreed with the captain. In their minds, they were already at war. They were cut off from Moscow and believed they were acting on their standing orders to defend themselves with all available weapons. This is where Vasili Arkhipov stepped in. Arkhipov was known to be a calm and level-headed officer. He had experienced a crisis before. Just 1 year earlier, he had been the deputy commander of a nuclear submarine that suffered a reactor coolant leak, exposing many of the crew to radiation. He had seen firsthand how quickly things could go wrong on a submarine. He understood the immense responsibility that came with controlling a nuclear weapon. While Captain Savitsky was panicking, Arkhipov remained calm. He looked at the situation logically and questioned the captain's assumptions. Arkhipov argued against launching the torpedo. He reasoned that the explosions were not necessarily an attack. He suggested they might be signals from the Americans, trying to get them to surface. He knew that firing a nuclear weapon without a direct confirmed order from Moscow would be a catastrophic mistake. It would start a war that could not be stopped. He stood his ground against the captain and the political officer. An intense argument broke out in the cramped control room, deep under the sea. Two men wanted to launch the weapon that would almost certainly start World War III, but one man, Vasili Arkhipov, stood firmly in their way. The argument in the control room of B-59 was one of the most important confrontations in human history, yet the world knew nothing about it at the time. Captain Savitsky was adamant. He was the commander of the vessel, and he felt the full weight of what he perceived as an attack on his submarine and his crew. He was convinced that their only honorable option was to retaliate with their most powerful weapon. The political officer sided with him, creating a 2-against-1 scenario. In the intense claustrophobic heat of the submarine, with the sound of explosions outside, it would have been very easy for Vasili Arkhipov to give in to the pressure and agree. But Arkhipov did not yield. He used his authority as flotilla commander to challenge the captain's decision. He calmly insisted that they had no proof they were under a lethal attack. He pointed out that their radio communications were down, and they had no idea what the political situation was on the surface. To launch a nuclear torpedo under these circumstances would be an irreversible gamble with the fate of the entire world. He was able to talk the captain down from the edge of panic. He persuaded Savitsky that the best course of action was to surface the submarine and re-establish contact with Moscow to get new orders. Eventually, Captain Savitsky relented. He agreed with Archipov's logic and rescinded the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. He gave the command to bring the beleaguered submarine to the surface. As B-59 broke through the waves, it found itself surrounded by American warships. The United States Navy ships did not attack. They saw the submarine surface and held their fire, recognizing it as a sign of de-escalation. The crew of B-59, exhausted and dehydrated, finally breathed fresh air and were able to repair their communications equipment. They soon received the message from Moscow to stand down and return to their home base. The crisis below the waves was over. By refusing to give his consent, Vasili Arkhipov single-handedly prevented the launch of a nuclear torpedo. If that torpedo had been fired, it would have destroyed the American aircraft carrier USS Randolph and its escort ships. The United States, believing it was under a surprise nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, would have most certainly launched a massive retaliatory nuclear strike. This would have triggered an all-out nuclear war between the two superpowers, leading to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people and the potential end of civilization. One man's courage and clear thinking in a moment of extreme duress prevented that outcome. While Vasili Arkhipov was making his fateful decision beneath the sea, the leaders on the surface were also finding a way back from the brink. The events of Black Saturday, including the downing of the U-2 spy plane, had shocked both Kennedy and Khrushchev. They realized the situation was spiraling out of their control. They both understood that they had to find a diplomatic solution immediately, before an accidental or unauthorized action by their military forces triggered a full-scale war. The secret negotiations became more urgent and more direct, driven by the shared fear of mutual annihilation. President Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, met secretly with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. In this crucial meeting, Robert Kennedy conveyed a deal. The United States would publicly promise never to invade Cuba. In addition, he gave a secret assurance that the American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey, the very missiles that had prompted Khrushchev to act in the first place, would be removed a few months later. This secret part of the deal was essential. It allowed Khrushchev to present the outcome as a victory to his government, a way to save face while backing down. On the morning of October 28, 1962, a message from Nikita Khrushchev was broadcast on Radio Moscow. He announced that he had ordered the dismantling of the missile sites in Cuba and the return of all Soviet offensive weapons to the Soviet Union. The world let out a collective sigh of relief. The immediate crisis was over. The Soviet ships turned back from the quarantine line. The American military lowered its alert status from DEFCON 2. For 13 days, the world had stood at the abyss, and now it had taken a step back. The immediate danger of nuclear war had passed. In the aftermath, both superpowers recognized how dangerously close they had come to disaster. To prevent such a crisis from happening again, they established the Moscow-Washington hotline. This was a direct communication link between the leaders of the two countries, designed to allow for clear and immediate discussion during future emergencies. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in the Cold War. It scared both sides so much that it led to a period of reduced tension and the beginning of negotiations for arms control treaties, like the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty signed in 1963. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and sobering lesson about the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship. The story of Vasili Arkhipov and the submarine B-59 was not known to the public for many decades. The details of what happened in that control room remained a classified military secret in Russia. The men who were there returned home not as heroes but as officers who had failed in their mission. Arkhipov continued his career in the Soviet Navy, eventually rising to the rank of Vice Admiral. He passed away in 1998, and the full story of his incredible act of courage only came to light years later at a conference marking the 40th anniversary of the crisis in 2002. When the truth was finally revealed, historians and officials who had studied the crisis were stunned. Robert McNamara, who was the United States Secretary of Defense during the crisis, stated that he had not known until then just how close the world had come to nuclear war. The realization that the decision to start World War III had come down to a single vote in a sweltering, isolated submarine was a chilling revelation. It showed that history is not only shaped by presidents and premiers in grand meeting rooms, but also by lesser-known individuals facing immense pressure in extraordinary circumstances. Vasili Arkhipov has since become known as the man who saved the world. His story is a powerful reminder that individual choices matter, even in the face of massive global forces. He was not a world leader, but his personal bravery, his calmness under fire, and his ability to think clearly when others were panicking had a profound impact on the course of history. He understood the finality of a nuclear decision. He knew that once that button was pushed, there was no going back. His refusal to consent was not an act of cowardice or disobedience, but an act of profound wisdom and humanity. The lesson of Vasili Arkhipov's legacy is timeless. It teaches us about the importance of character, courage, and critical thinking. In any crisis, whether it is personal or global, the ability to resist fear and pressure, to question assumptions, and to choose a path of restraint can make all the difference. His story demonstrates that one person, guided by a strong moral compass, can stand against the tide and prevent an unimaginable catastrophe. The world owes an enormous debt to Vasili Arkhipov, the quiet naval officer who, in a dark moment deep beneath the sea, chose peace over war and gave humanity a future.